back to The Explainer. Today, we are unpacking one of the most fascinating architectural blueprints you'll find in historical literature, Ezekiel's temple. But listen, we aren't just going to sit here and look at ancient stones and tape measures. We're digging into what this massive space was actually built to do. We're talking strict boundaries, absolute holiness, and the incredibly dramatic return of the divine presence. We are going to map out exactly how this entire complex was designed to function.
But first, as always, we're going to kick things off with our standard TN Inside greeting. Hello, everyone. This is TN Inside. Let's begin by reading today's scripture passage from the book of Ezekiel, chapters 42 and 43.
So, here is our roadmap for today. It's a three-part journey. First, we'll look at the physical preparations happening in the priest's rooms. Second, we'll hit the absolute climax of the vision, where the glory returns. And finally, we'll head to the center of the whole operation, the altar of atonement.
All right, let's jump straight into part one, the priest's rooms.
Picture this. You are walking right alongside Ezekiel as he's led into the outer court. And right in front of us is this incredibly specific architectural blueprint of the rooms where the priests actually operated. Now, these weren't just simple pop-up tents. They were complex, three-story structures. And there's this fascinating little architectural detail noted in the text. The upper floors were actually narrower than the lower floors. Why? Simply because the upper-level support structures ate up more space than the base. It's this super grounded, almost mundane architectural detail right smack in the middle of a mind-blowing grand vision.
And, this brilliantly illustrates just how insanely strict the procedures were for the priests. Talk about a serious dress code. The garments they wore were specially made for God's sacred work, meaning they were considered literally holy. So a priest couldn't just clock out and walk into the public square wearing them. No way. They had to perform their duties and then immediately remove those holy garments, store them safely in these specific holy rooms, change completely back into their regular everyday clothes, and only then could they step out into the outer court. It was this rigorous, ironclad system designed to keep sacred duties completely separated from everyday public spaces.
But hey, these rooms weren't just ancient locker rooms for changing clothes. They were actually highly restricted dining areas. When the priests approached the Lord, they would use these exact spaces to eat the most holy offerings. We're talking specific grain offerings, sin offerings, and guilt offerings. Now, unlike a peace offering, which, the wider community could kind of share in, these most holy offerings were entirely, exclusively dedicated to God. They could only be eaten by the priests, and only within these sacred, heavily restricted walls.
Now, what's really profound here is this whole concept of spatial boundaries. The text describes this massive wall, 500 cubits long on every single side, just entirely surrounding the temple. Why build such a gigantic barrier? Well, it was the ultimate dividing line between the holy and the common. Everything inside those 500-cubit walls was holy. It was entirely, 100% dedicated to the use of a holy God. And everything outside those walls, that was common, accessible to anyone at any time. It's a huge visual reminder that absolute purity requires absolute boundaries.
Moving on to part two, and honestly the climax of the whole vision, the glory returns.
We have officially reached the dramatic peak. Just listen to the sensory language used here. His voice was like the sound of rushing waters, and the earth was illuminated with his glory. Ezekiel is describing the awe-inspiring return of God's visible presence and power. And let me tell you, it is not a quiet, subtle little entrance. It is completely overwhelming to the human senses, deafening, like standing next to a massive, rushing waterfall, and blindingly bright, literally illuminating the entire earth. This is the ultimate arrival.
To really grasp the sheer joy of this moment, we got to rewind and look at the historical context. Exactly 19 years prior, in Ezekiel chapter 10, he saw this heartbreaking vision of God's glory literally packing up and departing from the temple through the east gate, and that was all because of the people's rebellion. Following that departure, the Israelites lived out this miserable, incredibly harsh existence in Babylonian exile. But now, 19 years later, the glory returns through that exact same east gate. Imagine being an exiled person who had lost everything. This vision wasn't just some neat architecture, it was a massive lifeline of hope and liberation.
Right then and there, Ezekiel hears a voice coming directly from the temple itself. God declares that this is the place of his throne, the place where he will put his feet, and crucially, the place where he will dwell forever with the people. It is a promise of total, absolute restoration. The broken relationship between God and Israel, it's declared healed. God commits to an eternal dwelling right there among them.
But the reaction to this incredible promise is actually deeply fascinating. You'd think they'd just be popping confetti and throwing a party, right?
Actually, no. The text notes that this new, perfectly holy temple caused the people to feel overwhelming shame. Why? Because pure holiness acts like a giant mirror. Seeing the absolute perfection and the strict boundaries of this new temple exposed exactly how far they had fallen in the past. They remembered dragging idols right into the sacred spaces of the old temple, and suddenly, confronted with such intense, blinding holiness, they felt a really deep psychological shame over those past detestable sins.
Which brings us to part 3, the altar of atonement.
So moving inward from the perimeter right into the beating heart of the temple complex, Ezekiel meticulously records the dimensions of the altar, because this was the most vital mechanism in the entire place. The primary, day-to-day function of the temple was atonement, and the altar was exactly where that happened. They presented burnt offerings, thanksgiving offerings, and sin offerings. But take a close look at the required purifiers here. Blood was used to purify the altar and provide atonement for sin. And remarkably, salt was heavily sprinkled on the burnt offerings. Why? To prevent decay and physically maintain purity.
So what's the deal with the salt? It wasn't just a handed preservative. It actually represented the covenant of salt. This was a powerful symbol of an enduring, permanent, and completely unchanging duty to keep God's sacrificial laws. And Ezekiel, being a priest himself, would have understood this deep in his bones. He knew that when the priests faithfully honored this unbreakable covenant of salt, the entire community experienced true, lasting peace.
All right, let's bring this home to the present day. The temple today.
As we pivot to the living application of this text, history kind of proves a big point here. These magnificent physical temples were ultimately temporary structures. Solomon's Grand Temple, entirely destroyed by the Babylonians. Centuries later, the massive, spectacular expansion known as Herod's Temple, completely leveled by the Roman army in AD 70. These historical stone buildings were always meant to point towards something far greater and far more permanent.
And the source material draws a direct line from Ezekiel's vision of God's glory filling the temple, right to the arrival of Jesus. John 1:14 says, "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us." The New Testament teaches that God's ultimate presence, that brilliant rushing water glory that Ezekiel saw, is actually fully revealed and embodied in the person of Jesus Christ.
And here is where it gets incredibly personal. Romans 8:9 tells us that if the Spirit of God lives in you, you are in the Spirit. The stunning New Testament truth here is that the Christian believer's own body has now become that very temple. You are the space where God's holy presence dwells forever. The eternal temple isn't some stone building over in Jerusalem anymore. It's literally the human heart.
Which leaves us with a very provocative question to consider today. We just spent this entire explainer looking at Ezekiel's massive 500-cubit walls specifically designed to separate the holy from the common. So if your life, if your very body is now God's eternal dwelling place, what common things are you actively keeping out of your holy temple? Think about it. We'll see you next time.